The alarm on the bridge cut through my thoughts before I even understood what it meant. Red light bathed the command deck of the Kael'thor Dominion flagship, the Ashen Veil, and every officer around me turned toward the main viewport at once. I am Valor Kren, second son of the Kael'thi royal line, and until that moment I had never once feared a battle. My family had ruled 12 star systems for 300 years. We had faced down the Rithari swarms and the Voss collective without losing a single throne world. So when the censor officer reported a single unknown vessel crossing into our border space near the Ashvale Reach, I expected nothing more than a formality. "Single contact," the officer said, her voice steady but quick. "Unregistered signature. Estimated mass places it well below any known warship class." I stepped closer to the viewport, watching the tactical display update. A small dot blinked at the very edge of our detection range, moving with a strange, almost lazy drift, as if it had no idea it had just wandered into the territory of an empire that had never lost a war. "Human," said Commander Isolde Thrain, our senior fleet officer, reading the signature analysis. "A Terran vessel. Small. No weapon signature beyond standard defensive plating." The word Terran meant little to me then. I had heard of humans the way one hears of a distant storm on a world you will never visit. A rumor, a footnote in an intelligence briefing, a species barely a century into real spaceflight according to our analysts. They were young. They were, by every measure my tutors had ever taught me, unimportant. "A scouting craft," Isolde said, almost dismissively. "Recon unit, most likely. They do this sometimes. Send a single ship to map a border, take some readings, then leave before anyone notices." "But we noticed," I said. "We noticed," she agreed, and there was the faintest note of pride in her voice, the kind that comes before a fall no one sees approaching. My father, King Threnuk Kren, was not aboard the Ashen Veil that day. He had left me in command of this small border patrol as part of my continuing education in fleet leadership, a gentle season of easy victories meant to prepare me for a future throne. Intercepting an unarmed scout ship seemed like exactly the kind of lesson he had in mind. Low risk, high confidence, a clean capture to add to my record. "Dispatch a strike wing," I ordered. 6 vessels. I want that ship intact if possible. If it resists, disable it. There is no need for anything more than that. Isolde nodded and relayed the command. Within minutes, 6 sleek Kael'thor interceptors peeled away from the Ashen Veil's launch bays, arranging themselves into a wide net formation designed to box in and slow any fleeing vessel. I watched from the bridge with something close to boredom. I remember thinking that I would be back in my private quarters within the hour, filing a report so uneventful my father would barely read past the first line. The human ship did not run. That was the first sign that something about this encounter was not going to follow the shape I expected. Our strike wing broadcasted the standard demand for surrender in the trade language most border species understood, a courtesy more than a requirement. There was a pause of nearly 11 seconds, long enough that Isolde actually turned to look at me, as if to share a private joke about how slow humans must be to respond. Then the small ship moved. It did not move like a frightened animal fleeing a predator. It moved like something that had already calculated every angle of the trap being laid around it, and found the one gap nobody had thought to close. Our formation, built to corner a slow retreating target, suddenly found itself with a target that was no longer where the formation expected it to be. "Explain that," I said, watching the tactical display recalculate the human ship's position for the 3rd time in under a minute. My prince, it should not be capable of that acceleration," the sensor officer said, her composure cracking just slightly. "The mass reading doesn't match the thrust output we're seeing." I felt the first small stir of unease, though I did not yet understand it for what it was. I told myself it was simply an unusual ship design, nothing more. Species built strange vessels all the time. This meant nothing. Our interceptors adjusted, tightening the net, and I watched the human vessel slip between 2 of our ships with a margin so narrow that Isolde actually gasped beside me, a sound I had never once heard her make in the years I had known her. "Weapons fire," she reported next, and I turned sharply toward her. Minimal, defensive in nature. They're not attacking our ships, my prince. They're clearing a path. I remember exhaling, some of the tension leaving my shoulders. Defensive fire, not an attack. This still fit the shape of the story I had told myself. The comforting one, where this was simply a fast, well-piloted scout ship trying to avoid capture. Nothing more dangerous than that. Continue the pursuit, I said. Non-lethal containment only. I still want it captured, not destroyed. The chase that followed lasted only minutes by the ship's clock, though it felt far longer standing on that bridge, watching 6 of our finest vessels fail again and again to close the distance on a single unarmed recon craft. Each time our formation adjusted, the human pilot found the seam in it before our own tactical officers had finished calculating the adjustment. It was not luck. I understood that even then, though I did not yet want to admit what it meant. Luck does not repeat itself 6 times in a row against 6 different approach vectors. They're heading toward the debris field near the third moon, Isolde said, studying the display. If they reach it, our sensors will lose fine targeting resolution. Then close the gap before they reach it, I said, more sharply than I intended. Our lead interceptor, the Vantor, surged forward, finally gaining real ground on the smaller craft. For a moment, I allowed myself to believe the chase was ending in exactly the clean, forgettable way I had wanted. Then the human ship did something I have turned over in my memory 1,000 times since, trying to understand how a crew of what our records would later confirm was only 5 people managed to outthink an entire strike wing in real time. It stopped, not slowed. Stopped, fully and immediately, in a way that should have torn its own hull apart under the inertia. Our lead interceptor, still accelerating to close the gap, shot past it before its own systems could compensate, suddenly finding itself in front of the very ship it had been chasing, rather than behind it. Impossible, Isolde whispered, and I found I had no correction to offer her, because I did not understand it either. The human vessel used that single heartbeat of confusion, that one moment where the hunter became the hunted without ever meaning to, and it slipped past our entire formation toward the debris field beyond. I remember the bridge falling silent, every officer around me staring at the display as if it might change if we looked at it hard enough. Recall the strike wing, I said quietly. Let them go. My prince. Isolde turned to me, surprised. We came here to capture an unarmed scout, I said, though even as I spoke the words I felt how hollow they had become. We do not need to risk 6 vessels chasing something into a debris field we cannot properly scan. Recall them. She gave the order, and I watched our interceptors peel away from the pursuit, reassembling into a loose formation as the human ship vanished into the scattered rock and metal of the debris field beyond the third moon. For a long moment, nobody on the bridge spoke. I stood at the viewport, watching the empty space where a single, unarmed craft had just outmaneuvered 6 of the finest ships in the Kael'thor fleet, and I felt something I had never felt before in my life as a member of the royal line. I felt small. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself that this was simply an unusually skilled pilot, a lucky configuration of engines and hull, an anomaly not worth troubling my father with in my report. I told myself many things in the quiet minutes that followed, standing on that bridge with my hands folded behind my back, the way I had been taught a prince should stand, calm and unshaken, no matter what. But some part of me, the part that had grown up hearing stories of the Rithari swarms and the Voss collective and every other threat my family had ever crushed beneath the weight of our fleets, understood that something had just happened that did not fit any story I had been told. A single unarmed recon ship, crewed by a handful of a species barely a century into real spaceflight, had just made 6 of our warships look like children playing at a game they did not understand. Compile a full report, I told Isolde, my voice quieter now than it had been at the start of the encounter. Every sensor log, every maneuver. I want to see exactly what that ship did, and I want to understand how it did it. Of course, my prince, she said, and if she felt any of the same unease creeping through me, she did not show it on her face. But I noticed, as the bridge crew began their reports and the Ashen Veil settled back into its patrol pattern, that more than one officer kept glancing toward the debris field where the human ship had vanished, as if expecting it to reappear. It did not reappear. Not that day. But I remember standing there long after the reports had been filed and the bridge had returned to its normal quiet hum, staring at the empty space on the viewport, and thinking that whatever we had just encountered was not something we understood at all. We had called it a Recon unit. We had called it unarmed, unimportant, beneath our notice. I did not yet know how wrong that assumption was, or how much more I would come to fear the answer once I did. The full report reached my private quarters 3 hours later, and I remember reading it standing up, because I could not bring myself to sit while going through what Isolde's analysts had put together. What had looked, in the moment, like a single lucky escape became something far more troubling once laid out maneuver by maneuver, second by second, across dozens of pages of sensor data. The human pilot had not simply reacted well. Every adjustment, every burst of thrust, every sudden stop had been calculated with a precision that our own tactical computers struggled to reproduce even after the fact, with the luxury of hindsight and unlimited processing time. I called for Isolde and our chief tactical officer, a broad, steady man named Draymond Voss, to review the data with me before I brought any of it to my father. The acceleration profile alone should not be possible, Draymond said, pointing to a graph that spiked and dropped in patterns that looked almost jagged, deliberately unpredictable. Not for a vessel that size. Either their engines are far more advanced than our intelligence reports suggest, or their pilot was pushing the ship past what its own systems were rated for and accepting the risk. Which is it? I asked. Both, possibly, he admitted. Neither answer is comforting, my prince. I ordered a second patrol sent out the following day, not to hunt the same vessel, but simply to sweep the border region and confirm it had truly left our space. I told myself this was caution, not fear. A prince learning the shape of a new threat before reporting it upward, nothing more. The second patrol found nothing. No trace of the human ship, no further contacts, nothing but empty space and drifting debris where the encounter had taken place. For 2 days, I allowed myself to believe the matter was closed, an unusual footnote in an otherwise quiet border assignment. On the third day, the same ship returned. I know now, from everything that followed, that it was never truly gone. It had simply moved to a position where it could continue whatever survey mission had brought it to our border in the first place. Patient in a way I had not expected from a species our reports described as reckless and impulsive. When our long-range sensors picked up its signature again, I was in the officer's mess, and I remember setting down my cup so quickly that it nearly cracked against the table. Same signature, Isolde confirmed when I reached the bridge. It has returned to a position near the outer edge of the Ashvale Reach. It does not appear to be approaching our patrol routes directly. If anything, my prince, it looks as though it is simply continuing its survey. Continuing, I repeated, as though nothing happened. As though nothing happened, she agreed, and I heard in her voice the same unease I felt building in my own chest. This time, I did not want to repeat the mistake of sending a strike wing built around the assumption that we faced something weak. I ordered a larger formation, 10 vessels instead of 6, spread across a wider containment pattern designed to close from multiple directions at once, rather than relying on a single net that a skilled pilot could slip through. I also ordered our fastest reconnaissance drones deployed ahead of the main formation, hoping to gather better data before any direct engagement began. You believe this will be different? Isolde asked me quietly, as the new formation began forming up in the launch bays below. I believe I underestimated what we were dealing with the first time, I said. I do not intend to make the same error twice. The drones went out first, small and fast, designed to observe rather than engage. For nearly 20 minutes, everything proceeded as expected. The drones closed the distance, gathered detailed sensor readings, and began relaying a clearer picture of the human vessel than we had managed to obtain during the chaos of the first encounter. It was, by every visible measure, an ordinary survey craft, 5 life signs aboard, a crew compartment barely larger than a shuttle, minimal weapons systems consisting of what our analysts identified as short-range defensive countermeasures rather than true offensive armament. On paper, it was exactly what Isolde had called it during our first encounter, a recon unit, nothing more. And yet, the moment our 10 interceptors began their approach, that small, unremarkable ship reacted with a speed and precision that made our earlier chase look almost gentle by comparison. "They've detected the formation," the sensor officer reported, her voice tightening. "They're not fleeing toward the debris field this time. They're moving to intercept the drones." "Intercept," I said. "Explain." Before she could answer, the tactical display updated, and I watched the human vessel execute a maneuver that made my chest tighten with something I did not immediately recognize as fear, because I had never truly felt fear as a member of the royal line before that moment. It moved directly toward our lead reconnaissance drone, not to destroy it, but to disable it, with a precisely targeted burst of countermeasure fire that our own analysts later confirmed had been calibrated to disrupt sensors without causing any lasting damage to the drone itself. "They disabled it without destroying it," Draymond said slowly, watching the same display. "That is not the behavior of a panicked crew trying to escape, my prince. That is the behavior of a crew that understands exactly what they are doing and is choosing restraint." I did not answer him immediately because I was watching our 10 interceptors begin to close in, and some part of me, the part that had grown up on stories of Kael'thor victories over the Rithari and the Voss, still expected this larger formation to succeed where the first one had failed. We had learned from our mistake. We had adjusted. Surely that would be enough. It was not. The human vessel moved through our expanded formation the way water moves through fingers that try too late to close around it. Every gap we thought we had closed, it found before our tactical computers finished processing the adjustment. Every angle we thought we had covered, it slipped past with margins so narrow that more than one of our pilots reported their proximity alarms triggering in the same breath as their targeting systems lost lock. "This is not possible," Isolde said, and I heard in her voice something I had never expected to hear from her, a woman who had served in our fleet for over 20 years and had faced down threats I had only read about in history texts. She sounded, for the first time in my presence, afraid. I watched 3 of our interceptors collide with each other's flight paths as they tried to adjust to the human ship's movements, their own pilots so focused on tracking a single small target that they lost awareness of their own formation. No lives were lost in that collision, a small mercy that did little to calm the growing dread settling over the bridge, but 2 of our vessels were forced to withdraw for repairs, effectively removing them from the engagement before it had truly begun. "They are not even firing on us," Draymond said quietly, almost to himself, as he watched the display. "Only defensive countermeasures, precisely calibrated to keep us at a distance without causing serious harm. My prince, I do not believe this crew intends to fight us at all." "Then why does it feel like we are losing?" I asked, and no one on the bridge had an answer for me. The engagement continued for nearly 40 minutes, far longer than the brief chase of our first encounter, and every minute added another layer to the unease building in my chest. Our remaining 8 interceptors adjusted their formation twice more, trying new configurations, new approach angles, new attempts to corner a single small craft crewed by only 5 people. Each time, the human vessel adapted faster than we could, slipping through gaps we had not yet realized existed, disabling our sensors and countermeasures with a precision that felt less like combat and more like a controlled demonstration of exactly how outmatched we truly were. Near the end of the engagement, something happened that I have never been able to fully explain to my own satisfaction, though I have turned it over in my mind more times than I can count in the time since. The human vessel, cornered at last between 4 of our remaining interceptors in a configuration our tactical computers assured us left no viable escape route, simply stopped moving. For nearly 10 seconds, it hung motionless in space, surrounded on all sides, and I remember holding my breath on the bridge, certain that we had finally succeeded, that this strange, impossible ship had finally run out of options. Then it moved directly between two of our interceptors, through a gap so narrow that our own pilots later reported they could see the hull markings on the human vessel as it passed, and it was gone, vanishing once again into the wider darkness of the border region before our formation could react. "Do not pursue," I said quietly, before Isolde could even ask the question. "Recall the formation, full withdrawal." Nobody on the bridge argued with the order. I do not think anyone had the heart to. We had sent 10 vessels against a single unarmed recon craft crewed by 5 people, and we had not simply failed to capture it. We had been outmaneuvered so thoroughly that 2 of our ships required repairs, and not a single shot we fired had come anywhere close to disabling our target, while every countermeasure they used against us had been precise, restrained, and utterly, terrifyingly effective. I stood on that bridge long after the withdrawal order had been carried out, staring at the empty space where the human vessel had vanished for the second time, and I felt the last of my earlier confidence drain away entirely. We had called this a Recon unit. We had called it weak, unimportant, beneath the notice of an empire that had ruled 12 star systems for 300 years. I no longer believed that was true, and the fear settling into my chest told me that whatever we had actually encountered was something far more significant than a simple scouting mission, though I still did not understand exactly what that meant. I only knew that I needed answers, and that the only way to find them would be to capture someone from that crew and hear, directly from their own mouth, exactly what we were truly dealing with. I did not yet know how much that answer would frighten me. My father summoned me 3 days later, and I knew from the tone of his message alone that word of the second engagement had already reached him, long before I had the chance to compose a report explaining what had happened in words that might soften the truth. King Threnok Kren did not summon his children lightly, and he certainly did not do so through a private channel rather than the formal chain of command, which meant he had heard something that troubled him enough to bypass protocol entirely. I traveled to the royal seat aboard a small transport, alone except for Isolde, who insisted on accompanying me despite my assurance that I could face my father's questions without her support. Looking back, I am grateful she came. I do not think I could have explained what we had witnessed nearly as clearly without her steady presence beside me. My father received us in his private council chamber rather than the throne hall, another sign of how seriously he had taken the reports. He was a tall man, gray now at the temples, with the kind of quiet authority that had never once needed raising his voice to fill a room. He did not rise when we entered, only gestured toward the seats across from him, his expression unreadable. "Tell me what happened," he said, without preamble. "Not the report. I have read the report. Tell me what you saw." I told him everything. The first encounter, the 6 interceptors outmaneuvered by a single scout craft, my decision to let it go rather than risk further losses in unfamiliar terrain. The second engagement, 10 vessels, the precise and restrained countermeasures, the impossible maneuvers, the withdrawal that had felt less like a tactical retreat and more like an acknowledgement of defeat against an enemy who had never once tried to seriously harm us. My father listened without interrupting, his fingers steepled in front of him, his eyes fixed on some point past my shoulder, as though he were seeing the engagement play out in his own mind. When I finished, the chamber remained silent for a long moment before he finally spoke. "You said the crew numbered only 5, he said, "and you believe this was a survey vessel, not a warship." "Every reading confirms it, Father. Minimal weapons, a crew compartment barely large enough for the 5 life signs we detected. No indication of military design in the hull configuration itself." "Then explain to me," he said, his voice quiet but carrying an edge I had rarely heard from him, "how a survey vessel, with a crew of 5 outmaneuvered 10 warships, crewed by trained officers of this dominion, without losing a single life among their own crew, and without seriously harming a single one of ours." I had no answer for him, because it was the same question that had haunted me since the moment our formation withdrew from that second engagement. My father rose from his seat and walked to the wide window overlooking the capital, his hands clasped behind his back, in the same posture I had unconsciously adopted during my own moments of uncertainty aboard the HFY. "I have read reports from our historians about this species," he said, without turning to face us. "Humans, barely a century into true spaceflight by most estimates. Young, by the standards of every civilization we have encountered. I confess I gave those reports little attention beyond confirming they posed no immediate threat to our borders. Father, if this truly was only a recon unit," I said carefully, "then I do not know what a genuine military response from this species would look like." He turned to face me then, and for the first time in my life, I saw something in my father's expression that I could only describe as unease, an emotion I had never once associated with the man who had ruled our dominion through every crisis of my childhood without ever showing a hint of doubt. "Neither do I," he admitted, "and that troubles me more than I care to say aloud in this chamber." He ordered a third patrol, larger still, but this time with different instructions entirely. Rather than attempting to capture or contain the human vessel, our goal would be to disable it just enough to force a landing, then recover the crew for questioning, rather than continuing to test our forces against tactics we clearly did not yet understand. I argued that this seemed unlikely to succeed any better than our previous attempts, but my father insisted, and I did not have the standing to refuse a direct order from the king. The third engagement, 3 weeks later, succeeded only through a combination of overwhelming numbers and what I can only describe as pure fortune. 15 vessels, spread across a containment pattern so wide it stretched across nearly the entire width of the Ashvale Reach, finally managed to corner the human vessel against the gravitational pull of a small, uninhabited moon, a natural barrier the pilot could not maneuver around no matter how skilled they proved to be. Even then, the engagement cost us dearly. 4 of our interceptors required significant repairs by the time the human vessel's engines finally failed under the combined strain of our countermeasures, and I remember standing on the bridge of the Ashenvale watching the small craft drift, powerless, toward the waiting recovery vessels, feeling none of the triumph I had expected, and only a hollow kind of relief that the engagement had finally ended. The crew we recovered numbered exactly 5, just as our sensors had indicated from the very beginning. 3 men and 2 women, all remarkably calm given the circumstances of their capture, none of them showing the fear or desperation I had expected from a crew that had just been overwhelmed by 15 warships after weeks of evading our forces entirely on their own. The one who spoke for the group during our initial questioning was a woman named Grace Colton, who our translators identified as the vessel's commanding officer despite her relatively young age by our own standards. She sat across from me in the interrogation chamber aboard the Ashenvale with an expression that unsettled me more than any hostility could have, because it held no fear at all, only a kind of tired patience, as though she had simply been delayed from more important work. "You understand," I said, through our translation system, "that you are in the custody of the Kael'thor Dominion, and that your continued cooperation will determine how this encounter concludes. I understand you sent 15 ships after a survey team of 5 people," she said, and there was no defiance in her voice, only a plain, matter-of-fact tone that somehow felt more unsettling than anger would have. "I'm not sure what you were hoping to accomplish beyond damaging your own fleet." I felt Isolde stiffen beside me at the bluntness of the response, but I raised a hand before she could speak, because something in Grace Colton's manner told me that pressing her with threats would accomplish far less than simply asking the questions that had haunted me since our first encounter. "Your vessel was designated a recon unit by our own intelligence," I said. "Is that an accurate description of your mission?" "Standard survey patrol," she confirmed. "Mapping border regions, cataloging stellar phenomena, checking for any unregistered contacts in the sector. We do this along most of our frontier space. It's routine work, honestly. A little boring most days." "Boring," I repeated, unable to keep the disbelief from my voice. "Your crew outmaneuvered 15 warships, and you call this boring?" For the first time since the questioning began, something like genuine surprise crossed her face, quickly replaced by an expression I could only describe as careful consideration, as though she were weighing how much to explain to someone who clearly did not understand something she considered basic knowledge. "You keep calling what my crew did outmaneuvering," she said slowly. "But we didn't fight your fleet. We avoided your fleet. There's a difference. If we'd actually wanted to cause damage, this conversation would look very different, and I don't think either of us would prefer that outcome." The room fell silent for a long moment, and I found myself studying her expression carefully, searching for any sign of exaggeration or bluff, the kind of posturing I might have expected from a captured officer trying to intimidate her captors into more lenient treatment. I found none. She spoke with the same plain, unhurried tone she had used throughout the entire conversation, as though stating an obvious fact rather than a threat. "Explain what you mean," I said. "Our ship carries defensive countermeasures," she said. "Designed to disable, disrupt, create distance. Nothing built to seriously harm another crew, because survey missions aren't supposed to end in serious harm to anyone, ours or yours. If your fleet had actually managed to trap us with hostile intent clear on both sides, we would have used different protocols entirely. The fact that we didn't should tell you something about how this encounter could have gone differently." I exchanged a glance with Isolde, who looked as unsettled by this explanation as I felt. Everything about the encounter, every maneuver we had witnessed across 3 separate engagements, suddenly reframed itself in my mind not as the desperate improvisation of a crew fighting for survival, but as the calm, practiced restraint of people who understood exactly how much force the situation required and had chosen to use no more than that. "Your crew never once attempted to seriously damage our vessels," I said slowly, working through the implications aloud. "Even when cornered, even when outnumbered 15 to 1. "That's right," she said, "because we weren't trying to win a fight. We were trying to finish a survey and go home. Those are very different goals, and I think your fleet may have confused one for the other." I sat with that statement for a long moment, feeling something cold settle into my chest that had nothing to do with the temperature of the interrogation chamber. If this crew of 5, engaged in nothing more than routine survey work, possessed the skill and restraint to consistently outmaneuver our forces without ever needing to resort to serious harm, then the question that had haunted me since our very first encounter returned with even greater weight. "What would a genuine conflict with your species look like?" I asked quietly. Not a survey crew avoiding capture, an actual military response. Grace Colton studied me for a long moment before answering, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried none of the plain, matter-of-fact tone from before, replaced instead by something quieter, almost careful, as though she were choosing her words with unusual precision. "I honestly hope you never find out," she said, "for your sake, not ours." The chamber fell silent again, and I found I had no further questions to ask, because everything I had wanted to understand about this encounter had just been answered in a way that troubled me far more than any hostile response could have. We had not fought a warship. We had not even fought a true recon unit pushed to its limits in genuine combat. We had spent weeks and risked dozens of vessels trying to capture 5 people engaged in nothing more than routine, almost boring survey work, and even then, we had only succeeded through overwhelming numbers and a fortunate gravitational trap that removed their ability to maneuver freely. I left the interrogation chamber that evening with more questions than I had carried into it, and a growing certainty that whatever conclusions my father's counsel would draw from this encounter, none of them would bring the comfort that our earlier assumptions about this young, unimportant species had once provided. Something in Grace Colton's careful, almost gentle warning had settled into my chest and refused to leave, and I suspected it would remain there long after this particular crisis had been resolved, one way or another. The council convened 2 days after my conversation with Grace Colton, and I had never before seen the chamber so full of unease among people who had spent their entire careers projecting unshakable confidence. My father sat at the head of the long table, flanked by Isolde and Draymond on one side and a row of senior advisors on the other, several of whom had served the Dominion since before I was born. I sat near the far end, close enough to speak when called upon, distant enough to observe the reactions of everyone in the room as the full sensor logs from all three engagements were displayed across the central table. Draymond presented the analysis first, walking through each engagement in careful detail, from the initial 6-vessel pursuit to the final 15-vessel containment that had finally succeeded only through favorable terrain. He highlighted the acceleration profiles that defied our own engineering models, the precision of the countermeasure fire that had disabled our sensors and drones without causing lasting damage, and the restraint shown even when the human vessel had been fully cornered with no apparent escape. "What troubles me most," Draymond said, pulling up a final chart that compared the human ship's performance against our own tactical benchmarks, "is not simply that this vessel outmaneuvered our forces. It is that every action taken by its crew appears deliberately restrained. They possessed clear opportunities to inflict serious damage on our vessels and consistently chose not to. This suggests a crew operating well within their actual capabilities, not at the edge of them." An older advisor named Corvain Rel, who had served 3 kings before my father and rarely spoke without careful consideration, leaned forward with an expression I had never seen him wear before, something between disbelief and dawning dread. "You are telling this council," he said slowly, "that a crew of 5 people, aboard an unarmed survey vessel, held back against 15 of our finest warships." "That is precisely what the data shows," Draymond confirmed. The chamber fell silent for a long moment, and I watched several of the older advisors exchange glances that carried decades of shared history between them, the kind of unspoken communication that comes from serving together through every crisis the Dominion had faced in living memory. "I have studied this species since the first reports of their existence reached our intelligence networks," Corvain said finally, addressing my father directly. "Every assessment described them as young, disorganized, prone to internal conflict rather than external expansion. We concluded, perhaps too quickly, that they posed no meaningful threat to our borders for generations yet to come." "And now?" my father asked. "Now I find myself questioning every assumption in those assessments," Corvain admitted. "If a routine survey crew, engaged in nothing more significant than mapping border space, possesses this level of skill and restraint, I no longer feel confident in any prediction we have made about what a genuine military engagement with this species would look like." I spoke then, though I had not intended to interrupt the older advisors so directly. Grace Colton told me she hoped we would never find out what a true conflict with her people would look like. She said it was for our sake, not hers. The words landed heavily across the chamber, and I watched my father's expression shift into something I rarely saw from him, a kind of grave consideration that suggested he was weighing possibilities he had not previously allowed himself to entertain. "Do you believe she was exaggerating?" he asked me directly, "attempting to intimidate you into more favorable treatment for her crew?" I thought carefully before answering, replaying the conversation in my mind, searching for any hint of performance or calculation in her tone that might have suggested manipulation rather than genuine warning. "I do not believe so, Father." She spoke without anger, without any attempt to frighten me for its own sake. If anything, she seemed almost reluctant to say it at all, as though she genuinely did not wish for that outcome to occur. Another advisor, a younger woman named Tessara Vaughn, who had risen through our fleet command structure faster than almost anyone in a generation, spoke up from further down the table. "There is a historical pattern worth considering here, my prince. Every species we have previously encountered and subdued built their military doctrine around visible strength, larger fleets, more aggressive posturing, weapons designed to demonstrate capability as much as to use it. This crew showed us the opposite: restraint, precision, a complete absence of any need to prove their capability through unnecessary force." "What does that suggest to you?" my father asked. "It suggests," Tessara said carefully, "that this species may not measure strength the way we do. We have always equated power with visible dominance, with fleets large enough to intimidate before a single shot is fired. If humans measure strength differently, through adaptability and restraint, rather than raw visible force, then our entire intelligence framework for assessing their threat level may be built on the wrong foundation entirely." The chamber grew quiet again, as everyone considered the weight of that statement. I thought of Grace Colton's calm, unhurried manner throughout our entire conversation, the complete absence of fear or desperation even after her crew had been overwhelmed by 15 warships, and I found myself agreeing with Tessara's assessment more than I wished to admit. "There is something else," Draymond said, pulling up a final piece of data that had not yet been shared with the full council. During our review of the third engagement, we detected a brief transmission sent from the human vessel just before their engines failed under our containment pressure. It was not directed at us. Our analysts believe it was a routine status update sent back toward human territory, the kind of communication a survey crew would send as a matter of standard procedure. "What did it contain?" my father asked. "Coordinates," Draymond said, "basic status information," and a single additional note, appended almost as an afterthought, indicating they had encountered unexpected resistance from a local territorial power and would require a longer return timeline than originally planned. I felt something cold settle over the chamber as the implication of that message became clear to everyone present at once. We had spent weeks, risked dozens of vessels, and finally succeeded only through overwhelming numbers and fortunate terrain in capturing a single survey crew, and their own report of the encounter, sent back to their own people, described it as nothing more than an inconvenient delay. They did not consider this a significant military engagement at all, Corvin said quietly, almost to himself. Even after being captured, even after weeks of evading our forces, their own account of events treats this as a minor obstacle rather than a genuine crisis. Which means, Tessara added, that whatever genuine crisis looks like to this species, our 3 engagements did not come close to it. My father rose from his seat and walked slowly around the table, his hands clasped behind his back, and I watched every advisor in the chamber track his movement with the careful attention of people waiting for guidance they were not certain existed. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight I had never heard from him before, not even during the darkest days of our conflicts with the Rithari swarms decades earlier. "I have ruled this dominion for over 30 years, he said. "I have faced enemies who commanded fleets 1,000 vessels strong, who threatened our throne worlds with weapons capable of ending entire civilizations in an afternoon. I have never once, in all that time, felt the particular unease I feel now, having reviewed the actions of a crew of 5 people who never intended to fight us at all." He stopped near the head of the table and looked directly at me, and I felt the full weight of his attention in a way that reminded me, uncomfortably, of the moment on the Ashenvale's bridge when I had first watched our strike wing fail to contain that single small vessel. "You ask their commanding officer what a genuine conflict with her people would look like," he said. "I find that I no longer wish to know the answer through direct experience. I would prefer we find another path entirely, one that does not require us to discover firsthand what lies beyond the restraint this crew showed us." The chamber remained silent for a long moment after his statement, and I understood, watching the faces of advisors who had spent their careers building an empire through conquest and the visible demonstration of overwhelming force, that something fundamental had shifted in how the Kael'thor Dominion viewed itself and its place among the stars. We had always measured our strength by comparing it to the strength of others, confident that our fleets, our histories of victory, our 3 centuries of unbroken rule, placed us safely above any threat we might encounter. That confidence had not survived contact with a survey crew of 5 people who had never once intended to fight us at all. "What do you propose, Father?" I asked quietly, though some part of me already suspected the answer before he spoke it aloud. "I propose," he said, "that this dominion do something it has not done in living memory. I propose we approach this species not as a threat to be contained, nor as a lesser power to be conquered, but as something we do not yet understand well enough to safely underestimate again." He looked around the chamber at each advisor in turn, and I saw in their expressions the same dawning realization I felt settling into my own chest, the understanding that everything we had believed about our place in the wider galaxy had just been quietly, thoroughly, and permanently reshaped by an encounter none of us had expected to matter at all. "Release the crew," he said finally, "with full honors, full apologies, and an offer of formal contact through proper diplomatic channels. I do not wish for our next encounter with this species to begin the way this one did." I felt a strange mixture of relief and lingering unease as the council began discussing the practical details of that decision, because even as I agreed entirely with my father's judgment, I could not shake the memory of Grace Colton's quiet, careful warning, spoken without malice, that I hoped I would never have reason to test. My father assigned me to personally oversee the release of the human crew, a task I accepted with a strange mixture of apprehension and something close to gratitude for the chance to see this encounter through to its conclusion rather than watching it resolve from a distance through second-hand reports. 3 weeks passed between the council's decision and the day we finally returned Grace Colton and her crew to their own people, weeks spent preparing a formal diplomatic overture unlike anything the Kael'thor Dominion had extended in over a century. I visited the detention quarters, where the crew had been held throughout those weeks, not for further questioning, but simply because I found myself unable to stop thinking about the conversation that had first unsettled every assumption I carried about our place among the stars. Grace Colton greeted me with the same calm, unhurried manner I remembered from our first meeting, though something in her expression had softened slightly, perhaps recognizing that the nature of her captivity had shifted from interrogation towards something closer to reluctant hospitality. "Your council reached a decision then," she said, before I had even finished explaining the purpose of my visit. "I take it we're being sent home." "With full honors," I confirmed, "and an offer of formal diplomatic contact between our peoples, extended through proper channels rather than the circumstances that first brought us together." She considered this for a long moment, and I noticed for the first time a kind of careful thoughtfulness in her expression that had not been present during our earlier, more guarded conversation. "That's a significant shift from where things started," she said. 15 warships doesn't usually end with an apology and a diplomatic invitation." "No," I admitted, "it does not." "What changed?" she asked, studying me with the same directness she had shown throughout our entire acquaintance. I thought carefully before answering, unwilling to overstate the council's deliberations, but equally unwilling to offer anything less than honesty to someone who had, in her own quiet way, taught me more about the limits of my own assumptions than any advisor or tutor had managed across my entire life. "We reviewed everything your crew did across 3 engagements," I said. "The restraint, the precision, the complete absence of any need to escalate beyond what the situation required, even when your ship was fully surrounded with no apparent path of escape. And that troubled you more than if we'd fought back with everything we had," she said. It was not quite a question. "Yes," I said. "It did." She nodded slowly, as though this confirmed something she had already suspected but had not wished to state aloud during our earlier conversation. "I think a lot of species make that same mistake early on," she said. "They assume the scariest version of an enemy is the one throwing everything they have at you without hesitation, but that kind of fighting usually comes from fear, or desperation, or simply not knowing any better. The version that should actually concern you is the one that could escalate freely and chooses not to, because that means the restraint itself is a choice, not a limitation." Her words settled into my chest with the same cold weight I had felt throughout the council's deliberations, and I found myself understanding, more clearly than any report or analysis had managed to convey, exactly why her earlier warning had unsettled my father so thoroughly. We had not encountered the limits of what her crew could do. We had encountered the limits of what they had been willing to do, and those were, as she had pointed out, 2 very different things entirely. The crew departed 3 days later aboard a Kael'thor transport vessel escorted to the edge of human territory, where representatives of what our translators identified as the Terran Fleet Command met us with a formality that felt, in its own quiet way, just as unsettling as the engagements that had preceded it. There was no visible show of force at the handoff point, no demonstration of military strength meant to impress or intimidate. Only a small delegation of officials who greeted the returned crew with warm, understated relief, and extended toward our own delegation a courteous, measured welcome that assumed neither hostility nor submission from either side. I stood beside Isolde during that exchange, watching Grace Colton reunite with colleagues who greeted her not as a returning hero from some great ordeal, but simply as someone who had experienced an unusually long delay on an otherwise routine assignment. There was no celebration, no dramatic retelling of the encounter for an eager audience. Just quiet handshakes, brief updates, and the kind of understated professionalism that somehow unsettled me more than any triumphant display could have. "They do not seem to consider this remarkable at all," I said quietly to Isolde, watching the scene unfold. "No," she agreed, "they do not." A human official, an older man named Owen Pierce, who our translators identified as a senior liaison officer, approached our delegation once the crew reunion had concluded, extending a formal greeting that acknowledged the diplomatic overture my father had authorized without any hint of the tension I had expected from a species that had just recovered a crew from weeks of unexpected detention. "We appreciate the gesture of goodwill," he said, his tone measured and courteous, "and we're prepared to discuss formal terms of contact between our peoples, provided both sides approach the process with mutual respect and clear boundaries." "The Kael'thor Dominion has ruled 12 star systems for 3 centuries," I said, unable to fully suppress the instinct to establish our own standing, even in the midst of an apology. "We do not extend such offers lightly." Owen Pierce studied me for a moment, with an expression that held no hostility, only a kind of patient understanding that somehow felt more unsettling than any pointed remark could have. "I understand that history matters a great deal to your people," he said. "I'd only ask that you understand something about ours in return. We don't measure our own history by the size of territory we've claimed. We measure it by what we've survived, and by what we've chosen not to become in the process of surviving it." The words hung in the air between us, and I found myself thinking of every report I had reviewed throughout the Council's deliberations, every piece of evidence suggesting that this species' true capabilities remained largely hidden beneath a surface of deliberate restraint. I wanted, in that moment, to ask directly what exactly humanity had survived, what history lay beneath that careful, measured confidence that seemed to require no demonstration of strength to feel secure in its own place among the stars. I did not ask. Some instinct told me that the answer, whatever it was, would only deepen the unease already settled into my chest since our very first encounter with Grace Colton's survey crew, and I was not certain I wished to carry that additional weight before returning home to report the results of this exchange to my father. The formal diplomatic talks that followed over the subsequent months proceeded with a careful, measured pace that neither side seemed inclined to rush. Kael'thor representatives met with their Terran counterparts across a series of neutral meetings, each side cautiously probing the boundaries of what a genuine relationship between our peoples might eventually look like. I attended several of these sessions at my father's insistence, both to continue my education in diplomatic matters and because he believed, correctly, that my direct experience with the initial encounter gave me a perspective none of our other representatives could offer. What struck me most, across every session, was the complete absence of any attempt by the human delegation to leverage the advantage they clearly held. They did not reference the 3 engagements. They did not remind us, even subtly, of how thoroughly their survey crew had outmaneuvered our fleet. They approached every discussion with the same measured, patient courtesy Owen Pierce had shown during our first meeting, treating our 2 peoples as equals engaging in a mutual process rather than a victor extending grudging terms to a defeated rival. I raised this observation privately with Grace Colton during one of the later diplomatic sessions, having developed over the preceding months something I might cautiously describe as a genuine, if still guarded, mutual understanding between us. "Your delegation has never once used our first encounter as leverage in these talks," I said. "I confess I expected otherwise, given how thoroughly your crew demonstrated its capabilities." She considered the observation for a moment, before answering, and I noticed again that same careful thoughtfulness that seemed to characterize every serious conversation I had shared with her since our first meeting in that interrogation chamber. Using it as leverage would suggest we saw that encounter as some kind of victory worth celebrating, she said. But nobody on my crew felt that way about it. We didn't want to fight your fleet. We wanted to finish our survey and go home. The fact that we had to spend weeks avoiding capture instead wasn't a triumph. It was just an unfortunate delay we'd have preferred to avoid entirely. And yet your crew's actions have fundamentally reshaped how my entire Dominion understands its place among the stars, I said. That seems like a significant outcome for what you describe as simply an unfortunate delay. She smiled slightly at that, the first genuine smile I had seen from her since our acquaintance began. Maybe that's the real lesson here, she said. The most significant things don't always come from the encounters that feel like victories. Sometimes they come from the quiet ones, the routine ones, the ones nobody expected to matter at all until afterward, when you look back and realize everything shifted because of them. I thought of that conversation often in the months that followed, as formal relations between the Kael'thor Dominion and the human territories slowly settled into something resembling genuine mutual respect, built not on the foundation of visible strength my people had always relied upon, but on a careful, patient understanding that some of the most significant power in the galaxy revealed itself not through grand displays of force, but through the quiet, deliberate choice to hold that force in reserve. My father received my final report on the matter with the same grave consideration he had shown throughout the entire affair, reading through my account of the diplomatic proceedings without interruption before finally setting the document aside and looking at me with an expression I had come to associate over the preceding months with his own quiet reckoning of everything this encounter had taught our Dominion about the limits of its own assumptions. "You have grown considerably since that first patrol along the Ashvale Reach," he said. "I confess, I did not expect a routine border assignment to teach you quite so much about the nature of true strength." "Nor did I, Father," I admitted. "I expected to capture an unarmed scout ship and file an unremarkable report before returning to more significant duties. Instead, I encountered something that reshaped how I understand power itself." "And what have you concluded, in the end?" he asked. "After everything this encounter has taught you?" I thought carefully before answering, drawing on months of reflection since that first alarm had sounded on the Ashenvale's bridge, since that first small, unremarkable vessel had slipped through our formation with a precision that had haunted every assumption I once carried about our place among the stars. "I have concluded," I said slowly, "that the most dangerous power in this galaxy may not belong to those who show us everything they are capable of. It may belong to those who show us only as much as circumstances require, and leave us to imagine, with growing unease, everything they have chosen not to reveal." My father nodded slowly, and in his expression I saw the same quiet, permanent shift that had settled over our entire Dominion since a single unarmed Recon unit had wandered across our border, and without ever intending to fight a war, taught an empire 3 centuries old the true, unsettling shape of its own limitations. We had called it a Recon unit. We had called it unarmed, unimportant, beneath the notice of a Dominion that had ruled 12 star systems through unbroken victory. In the end, that small, quiet, unremarkable encounter taught us more about the true nature of strength than any of the grand, decisive battles our history books had ever recorded, and I suspected, standing there in my father's council chamber with the weight of that lesson settled permanently into my chest, that neither the Kael'thor Dominion nor I would ever look at the stars the same way again.